Some visitors remark that the Lewis moorland seems like a desolate and barren wasteland, but nothing could actually be further from the truth. It's a complex, important and interesting ecosystem, a showcase for evolution which could be studied for an entire lifetime. It also has its own subtle beauty, both on the large scale, particularly in the slowly changing light, and also the small scale, like a miniature rainforest. It's also an extremely important resource, being a major carbon sink and a rich repository of climate data and human history because of the artifacts it contains. The island wasn't always covered in peat. In fact, shortly before it started to be deposited, it was probably covered by scrubby woodland of birch and hazel, with perhaps the odd Scots pine. But around 2000 BC, the climate changed and became wetter and colder, and the peat started to build up. Peat is formed in wetlands. That is when the water table is near the surface of the land, resulting in waterlogged soil and poor aeration. The copious water also leaches nutrients out of the soil, and these factors together prevent bacterial and fungal decay, and so the plant matter builds up in the soil, forming peat. The peat is also acid because of the stagnum moss, which is a major component of the ecosystem. And this generates its own acid environment, but more of this later. Wetlands as a whole form where water builds up until the water table rises. This might be because there's a natural dip in the land due to its topology, or it might be because of geology, impermeable rock beneath the soil through which water cannot drain out. Or it might be the pattern of rivers or streams that flow into an area. The classification of peatlands as a whole is complex. You might hear terms like mire, swamp, fen, bog, marsh. And this is because there are several different classification systems which originate in different countries. And the exact classification depends on the nutrient and aeration levels in the particular ecosystem. Anyway, without further ado, let's go out into the moor and see what interesting plants we can find on it. To explore the moor a bit further, we're going to visit this little strip which is behind Laxdale and Newmarket to see what interesting plants that we can find. The most important plant on the moor is one of the least conspicuous. As we said in the introduction, the stagnum moss, which underlies everything else and is the main component of the peat, which is lying underneath this. Unlike these sedges and grasses on top, stagnum is avascular. Mosses are one of the most primitive land plants, and they have no xylem or phloem, that is the veins inside normal plants which allow water to flow up and sugars to flow around the plant themselves. Instead, they rely on a diffusion of water and nutrients directly into the stems of the plant, so they have no roots as such like higher plants do. You can see all sorts of beautiful colours of them on the moor if you look closely, particularly in wetter areas. And they alter the environment by making it more acid, and that's one of the fundamental things about the moor. There's about 120 different species of stagnum moss. Some of these are dry type mosses, like the ones we can see here. Other ones are almost fully aquatic and grow in pools. In Gaelic, a moss in general is coinneach, but the stagnum is sometimes called riesc as well. Although the stagnum moss might be the plant which is responsible for structuring the moor the way it is, the one we associate with the moor the most is of course heather. And there are three types of heather which we can come across on the island commonly. The normal heather, which is also sometimes called ling. Heather in Gaelic is frigg, of course. Bell heather, which has a purple flower, And bog heather or marsh heather, which we can see down here, which has a sort of pinkish flower, which is larger than the normal bell heather. And in fact, this heather, the bog heather, is often called cross-leaved heath because the leaves form a little cross on the stem, whereas the leaves on a normal bell heather are sort of bushy and more disorganized. Heather was very useful in the past. It was used to make ropes and other things. It was also used to make a tea, which was used to treat urinary tract infections, and an alcohol called heather beer was brewed from it as well. So it is the iconic heather, the iconic plant of the moor, and of course forms the food for birds like the grouse as well. So it's very important from that point of view. Let's have a look at some of the lesser known plants now that we can find around the moor. This little yellow flower that looks almost like a miniature buttercup is tormentil. It's Gaelic, it's called Netherin, or sometimes Cartvar. It's actually a member of a rose family, and it's very common in the summer, speckling the whole moor with its tiny little pretty yellow flowers. It was used in the old days as a cure for diarrhea and also for sore throats. Everyone, I think, is familiar with bog cotton, which is Canoch in Gaelic. There are 4 different species of it. It's actually a sedge. And in the olden days it was used to dress wounds. The fibres in it are too short and too brittle to be woven into cloth, but old Gaelic literature does mention cloth which was made of Canoch. This little plant is called lousewort, not a very pleasant name. The Riavach in Gaelic, sometimes also red rattle. Very common on the moor, particularly beside roads that cross it. It's a semi-parasite. It takes some of its nutrient from roots of other plants. It steals its nutrient, and that's actually quite common for moor plants. Quite a number of the ones that we'll mention here do that. In the old days it was believed that sheep that grazed on it suffered from lice, and that's why it was called lousewort. Not a very pleasant name. I don't know if there's any truth in that claim or not. Just beside the lousewort there's another very common plant, not just on the moor but in all sorts of habitats on the island, which is called eyebright. And eyebright is called that because the flowers in it, which are tiny and very pretty, are look like tiny little eyes. In Gaelic it's called Lusnanlech. It's again a partial parasite like the lousewort. There's many different microspecies of it, and in the old days it was used for constipation, catarrh and sore eyes. And the fact it was used for sore eyes is an example of what's called the doctrine of signatures, in which the old people used to believe that if something bore a resemblance to a part of the body, like the eyes, then it could be used to cure that thing. Of course, we now know there's no truth in that, but that was an old folk belief. One extremely common plant on the island, which is not really a moorland plant, but can be found on the macher or grassland or even on your lawn, is self-heal. Self-heal is a plant which has been famed in folklore for its medicinal properties, and in fact some of these have been proved to be correct. It was used for treating both internal and external wounds, and also for sore throats. And it's very common all over the island. On the moorland, probably more beside paths, because it's not really a moorland plant. And the little blue flowers, which perhaps you can just see there, look like little miniature triffids and grow around the flower head, the cylindrical flower head outwards from it. In Gaelic it's got lots of different names, but sometimes it's called Fuscria. There are many different types of grasses and sedges and rushes grow on the moor, and I don't want to go into too much detail on those here because they really merit a video of their own. But one very distinctive one that you'll see on the moor is deergrass and its related kin, and it's a sort of very thin short grass here. It often forms a sort of dome structure. Grasses and rushes and sedges in Gaelic are often, or moorland ones are often called theanoch. So that's a sort of generic name for them. I'm not aware of a particular Gaelic name for this plant just by itself. Here's an interesting little plant. This little white flower is called stitchwort. So called because people in the old days thought that it could cure stitches. There's a couple of other common plants on the moor that we haven't seen today. One is milkwort, which was named because it was thought it could increase milk production in humans. So lactating mothers used to take it. And another one called lady's bedstraw. I'll put up pictures of these two plants for you to look at if we don't find them on our walk today. There are many other plants on the moor which are interesting and worthy of study, but I'll do separate videos on these so that you can get a picture of what they look like if we don't find them on our walk today.